Welcome everyone to this virtual lecture. So we're here to study the history of English. Let's have a brief look at some of the stages of the language that we can talk about. Usually when we talk about the history of the English language, we divide up into 4 periods, and this is what we're going to do in this course as well. So, the modern English period is everything after the 1700s. This is the language stage you're familiar with today. So, the language of the people like Charles Dickens, Jane Austen also fit into this category. When you look at the early modern English period, that is the language of people like Shakespeare. The Middle English period is before that, 1150 to 1500. The Middle English period, if you've heard of anyone writing this period, is probably Chaucer. And the Old English period is what happened when you go even back than that. So let's have a quick look through. Let's dive back in time and look what this language stage looks like. What we're going to do is to drop you in a very deep end with Old English and work forward to the modern age. It will go easier as it goes along. What I'm going to assume is that first of all, you know the basics of English phonetics. So when I present things in the International Phonetic Alphabet, you will have some clue. You'll at least be able to decode what I'm talking about. That's important because the spelling of the English language has changed massively over the years. I also assume that you know some basic things about morphology. Hopefully, you'll know what the difference between inflectional and derivational morphology is. And syntax, I'm going to assume that you know what basic grammatical relations are, like subject and an object. Today, in this lecture, we're just going to cover some background material. So I'm going to talk now for a while about where the English language came from, its origins. I'm going to talk also a bit about why I study the history of the English language. So, first of all, the course aim is to present the entire history of the English language from the start to the end. We're going to go further back to the ancestor of the English itself. We're going to talk about the ancestors in Germanic terms and Indo-European terms, because that's what we get to know. English is a Germanic language. It belongs to the Germanic family, and the Germanic family itself belongs to the Indo-European, which is a larger family which includes many of the languages of the world. We're going to talk about all kinds of changes that affected English over its history, changes that have happened purely internally on the one hand, and changes that are due to language contact on the other hand. As we will see, English has been in contact with lots of languages through its history. English sucks up features of other languages like a sponge, and that's something that we will be covering with relation to every period of the language. We'll be going through them in sequence, so we're going to start next time with ancestors of the language. We'll progress through Old English, Middle English, Early Modern English, and finally up to the present day. And we will be doing that in the space of, let's say, 3 or 4 lectures. Well, okay, then why study the history of English? The main answer is when you look at English, and I assume that since a lot of you want to become teachers of English, or you're studying English because you're at least interested in the language, you're interested in the English language, you start to see things that don't really make all that much sense. You start to see words that are spelled in weird ways. You start to see sentence structures where you think, why is it like that? And as soon as you start to get interested in that kind of questions, that's where linguistics comes in. Some questions receive a good answer from a purely synchronic perspective. Synchronic in the sense of what's going on right now, what's the structure of the system of the language. There are other questions, however, that really only make sense if you look at them from a historical perspective, if you look at where the language came from and how it arose, and that's what this course is for. The study of English history reveals many irregularities in spelling, pronunciation and grammar. By understanding the historical context, we can make sense of these irregularities and appreciate the evolution of the language. Exploring the history of English provides insight into how languages evolve over time. It allows us to trace the development of vocabulary, grammar, and syntax, showing how English has been shaped by various historical influences. Studying English or the history of English language offers a window into the cultural and historical context in which the language developed. It helps us understand the social, political, and economic factors that have influenced the language at different periods in history. English has borrowed words and structures from various numerous other languages throughout its history. Studying its evolution allows us to appreciate the linguistic diversity and multicultural influences that have contributed to the richness of the English language. By studying the history of English, we contribute to the preservation of cultural heritage. Understanding the origins of language allows us to appreciate the contributions of different cultures and communities to the development of English. Lastly, studying the history of the English language can be personally enriching. It deepens our appreciation for language as a dynamic and everlasting or ever-changing system, fostering a sense of curiosity about the world around us. So, if you take the English word fish, which is pronounced with an F sound, produced with the lips and the teeth, so it's a labiodental sound, and it's fricative because it's got continuous F flow. You've got the vowel E, and then you've got a sh sound, which is another fricative. So you take this word, and we try to transcribe it in the International Phonetic Alphabet. It would look something like this. So, all right, those are the sounds. If you think about the way these sounds are represented in English, they could equally well be represented in spelling by GH, an O, and then a TI. Why? Because there are other words in which that combination of sounds is used. So, for instance, in the word enough, the GH is pronounced F, so we can put a GH at the beginning of the word to mark out this F sound. What about the A sound, the vowel sound? Are there any words in which A is written as the letter O? Yes, there are words like women, which is pronounced with an A sound. So again, this second sound, A, can be written as an O letter. And as for the sh sound in a word like nation, the T and I stand for sh. So that's how you can write fish as GHOTI. Of course, the word spelled GHOTI is not even a real word, but it shows the inconsistency of English spelling. There are plenty of English words where you think, why on earth it is spelled like this? Well, similarly, the word cough, which is written with O-U-G-H, is pronounced off. For the word we just talked about, enough, is pronounced differently. The sequence of letters is pronounced off. So we've got off, we've got off, and in the word hiccup, which is sometimes spelled like this, is pronounced up. So the same sequence of sound can be pronounced off, up, up. It can also be pronounced oh, as in words like though, and it can be pronounced as ow, as in words like bow, for example, the bough of a tree. So basically, the takeaway message from here is that the English spelling and English pronunciation are not always the same. So you could say, I'm fine, I'm gonna learn the ways in which English spelling is pronounced. But you might also be curious about why is it like that? Why there isn't a nice mapping between letters and sounds like there is in other languages? For instance, if any of you have tried to learn Spanish or Italian, all the letters, well, I mean, not all of them, but most of them, map nicely into sounds. You know, when you look at a word, how it's going to be pronounced. Well, in fact, English was mostly spoken in the British Islands for most of its history up until about 1600. And in those isles, there have been people for a long time. When it gets interesting for us, it's about 3,000 years ago, because before that, we don't really know anything about the languages of the people of the region. But from 3,000 years ago, or thereabouts, we know that the Celts came into Britain, and the Celtic tribes, or at least some of them, migrated from Europe to England and to Britain more generally. In fact, all of the British Isles and Ireland were settled by these Celts. So at this point, 3,000 years ago, it's important to know there were no speakers of any Germanic languages. There were only these Celts, and the Celtic languages survived up until the present day in some parts of the British Isles. So in Wales, in Scotland, and in Ireland, there are Celtic languages still spoken today in varying degrees. For instance, when we take Welsh, the language of Wales, you find quite a lot of it spoken in North Wales and less in the south of Wales, though there are many people who speak it all over the place. In Ireland, there are still people who speak Irish, and in Scotland, there are speakers of Scots Gaelic again, mostly in the Highlands and Islands of Scotland. So in the far north of Scotland, not in places like Edinburgh and Glasgow, though again there are some. Celts were part of tribes, and each tribe had their own king or queen. This meant there was a lot of fighting between neighboring tribes. And in fact, the adjective British that goes with it actually comes from these Celtic people. It doesn't come from English itself, the Germanic language. It comes from the name of one of these Celtic speaking tribes called the Britons. The Celts are important because the Celtic language influenced the English language. Although they were the native inhabitants, the Celts' influence on the English language is limited due to their low status in society. Celtic words include river and place names like Kent, York, London, Dover, Thames, and Cornwall. So in recent years, there's been a lot of research that brought out the role of the Celts and that has encouraged people to think of the early history of English in terms of its contact with Celtic languages. Then we have another group who had an important impact, and that is the Roman Empire. Britain was part of the Roman Empire for a while. So when the Roman Empire was at its largest most, if not all of Europe and bits of what's now Africa and Asia were all under the control of this Roman Empire. And that meant, from a linguistic perspective, that the Celts, who were already in Britain, came into contact with the languages that the Romans were speaking. And those languages would have been various, but the main one would have been some variety of Latin. It's interesting to know that while England and Wales were part of the Roman Empire, Scotland was or never was, so Scotland was always independent. Romans' influence on the English language was at this time rather small. This would change later though, when Latin played a much bigger role with the coming of Christianity. Here we have some words from Roman traders such as cheese, papa, cattle, kitchen, belt, chest, pound, etc. So we've got already two families of languages that have been influential in the history of English. We've got Celts and we've got Romans. But we don't have anyone who is meaningfully the ancestor of the language, that is, the ancestor of the present-day English. So, what happens next? Well, in 449 AD, after the decline of the Roman Empire, a crucial period begins in the history of the British Isles. The Roman Empire, once a dominant force in Europe, had fallen, leading to significant disruptions in communication and trade between the British Isles and the continent. This disruption had profound consequences for the peoples inhabiting the region. During this period, various Celtic-speaking peoples populated the British Isles. With the decline of the Roman authority, these communities found themselves struggling for resources, and to some extent they are fighting among themselves. Well, here I'm following a story by the writer Bede, one of the earliest historians of Britain. He was writing in the Anglo-Saxon period. He describes this in terms of a Celtic king, Vortigern, who is struggling to retain his kingdom against the Picts. The Picts and the Irish are the two other groups of Celts coming from the north and from the west. The Celtic king promises to pay the Saxons from the mainland quite a lot of money in order to help them against the Picts. This deal somehow goes bad, and once the Saxons get to Britain, they don't end up leaving. That's the original story for the origin of the Germanic tribes and the origin of the English language in Britain. So when people ask you when did the English language begin, the usual date that people give is 449. Of course, it was far more complicated than that. It's not like as if suddenly a ton of people came over in one particular year and before that there was no one. This is just a convenient date picked out of historians that is usually used to denote the beginning of a period. There were in particular three Germanic tribes who came to England: the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. Alright, so that's where English came from. Somewhere in the 5th century, people who spoke a Germanic language moved to the British Isles, moved to England in particular. And where did they come from? That's quite an important point. They came from basically northern Germany and the Netherlands and Belgium, and to a certain extent Denmark. That's where these Germanic-speaking people came from. The Germanic tribes pushed the Celts into the north and west, mainly into what is now Wales, Scotland, and Ireland. These people spoke a West Germanic language, different from the Celtic language. Those Germanic tribes settled in seven smaller kingdoms: the Saxons in Essex, Wessex, and Sussex, the Angles in East Anglia, Mercia, and Northumbria, and the Jutes in Kent. So, when we divide up the language into periods, we're basing this on a couple of different things. We can either use the linguistic evidence, that is to say, the linguistic features of language, or we can use historical evidence, I mean things that happened external to the language, and in practice we do a little bit of both. So when we define Old English, we usually define it in terms of 450 to 1150. Why 450? Well, you can see 449 is the date we've got from Bede, the day the Germanic tribes begin to settle in Britain. Okay, why not 449 then, and instead 450? Well, that's because people who do history like round numbers, so basically just round up to 450. As you can see, these periods are useful in that we can divide up our attention in certain ways. So Old English is 450 to 1150, sometimes 1100 in the literature. Middle English is then 1150 to 1500. Here we can see more modern texts appearing, texts that look radically unlike Old English. As for the early modern English period, that is 1500 to 1700, quite a lot of things are happening at around 1500 that make this a useful cut-off date. For the first thing, there is a linguistic sound change called the Great Vowel Shift. For the second thing, this is when printing comes in at the very end of the 15th century. We find Caxton introducing his printing press into the British Isles. Another thing that happens at around about this time is that Columbus discovers America. And then the next cutoff point is 1700 for the modern English period. And there are again a few useful dates around here that we can use as a kind of benchmark. So the British monarchy is restored in 1660. We also find that in 1766 the US declares independence, and that marks what we might call the beginning of American English as a separate linguistic form. So, just to wrap up, what we've seen is that the English language has changed quite a lot. So, one of the questions that anyone should ask when they see something like that is why? Why has this happened? And that's one of the things that we're going to try and explain in our next lectures. The starting point of English was the Germanic tribes. What is traditionally called an invasion might have been called more like a peaceful migration. We've talked about the three main historical periods, Old, Middle, and Early Modern English, and I've tried to give some reasons why you should learn about the history of English language in the first place. All of this is going to come back as the course goes on. Our next lecture will be on the ancestors of English and the Old English period. And that's it for today. See you for the next adventure. This recorded presentation is based on the following references.